Thank you, Mr President. I rise just to make a few comments this evening on the state of aviation and its regulation in Australia. First off, I wish to just note the appointment of Jeff Boyd to the CASA board by the government, which I welcome. Mr Boyd has a long history in the aviation industry, both as a layman in the understanding the engineering, mechanical side, as well as in flight instruction and through to his ownership and running of Brindabella Airlines. He has a depth of experience which will be very welcome on the board, and I look forward to the government's appointments of other board members in the near future, particularly as the board will have a key role in implementing the recommendations as the government approves them from the Fawcett review into aviation safety regulation. The issue I'd like to touch on tonight, though, is on a small group of people in the aviation environment. One of the characteristics of a plural liberal democracy such as we have here in Australia is that we respect and look after the rights of minorities. And amongst the pilot population in Australia, which is, all the estimates vary, but well over 30,000, there's a small group numbering in their hundreds, potentially around 400, who have a colour vision deficiency. Now, for many years, in fact, going right back, I think the first publication that dealt with this was in 1926, people made the assumption, as they looked at aircraft deriving from the days of sailing ships and steamships, where they had red and green lights for navigation lights, that if a pilot couldn't discriminate colours, then he wasn't safe to fly by night. And since 1926, that document has formed bodies of thought that have flowed through into regulation. The current ICAO document, it's the international organisation that looks after civil aviation, recognises that, to use climate change terms, the science is not settled. They're not actually sure what difference a colour vision deficiency makes to an individual's ability to safely pilot an aircraft by day or by night. Despite that, regulators around the world have tended to err on the side of safety and say, well, we won't let people fly by night unless they pass one of a number of tests. What that has meant is that for around about 9% of the male population around the world, those who would aspire to be pilots or even air traffic controllers are often denied that opportunity. Now, that changed here in Australia about 25 years ago. In the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, there's a case that's become known as the Denison case, where a colour vision deficient pilot took the regulator to the tribunal saying, this is unfair, I can demonstrate that I'm competent to fly. And so the Commonwealth, because of the degree of interest, actually funded the applicant as well as the defence through then the CAA. And so you had a test case where both parties brought in lots of experts, and at the end of it, the judgment was made that, in fact, pilots who had a colour vision deficiency should be able to demonstrate their competence and be licensed to fly. The only condition that was put on that was that they couldn't captain high-capacity airline-type aircraft. As a result of that, Australia is unique in the world in that we now have some 25 years of experience of people with a colour vision deficiency who have been flying, and they've been flying everything from light aircraft by day through to regional type airliners, single pilot, for example overnight freight or role flying doctor service, or through to co-pilot roles in particularly regional type aircraft. We also have, because a number of the principal medical officers within the Civil Aviation Safety Authority have sought to facilitate the ability of people with a colour vision deficiency to fly, and they've implemented things like practical flight tests for people to demonstrate their competence. I know of some people who are now captaining large capacity airline aircraft and have been doing so quite safely for numbers of years, and in some cases well over 10,000 hours of flying. And what that says is that despite the theory, much of which has its origins in concept back to that 1926 document, practice shows that people with a colour vision deficiency can operate an aircraft safely. There are 4 key areas that people raise concerns about. One is to do with the tower. If you lose your radio and there's a control tower, you have to look for a red light or a green light or flashing lights to tell you whether you can land, take off, etc. And people are concerned that if you can't distinguish the lights, then you wouldn't be able to safely land. Well, again, that was probably valid in 1926, but the reality is the approach plates that I use when I fly and that other pilots have, on the top of it is the phone number for the tower. And it says, if you lose radio contact, phone the tower. And the headset that I use, like many others, has a Bluetooth connection for a phone. So you can quite safely, if you need to, have a redundant system that's specified in the publications to call the tower. And so I think that argument is somewhat outdated. There is also an argument that with the advent of EFA screens or glass cockpits, that the increased use of colour means that you must be able to distinguish those colours in order to be able to safely operate. Now clearly the pilots who have been flying, and one recently underwent a test in a simulator with a CASA flying operations inspector, and he specifically asked him to test him on all the night sequences, information from the cockpit, and he was assessed as being quite safe to operate. In my own experience of modifying aircraft and certifying them for use with night vision goggles, one of the common applications in the cockpit is to put a large green filter over the glass displays, and so all of the colour hierarchies are essentially diminished because you now have this green filter, and yet we certify the aircraft and pilots fly quite happily by day, by night, with no incidents. And so whilst the colour is nice to have, clearly it is not an essential characteristic of the cockpit. There's also concerns about traffic, whether you'll see the position lights on aircraft. But the reality is many aircraft now have bright white flashing strobe lights for collision avoidance. And the interesting part is over the 25 years, the aircraft that most of these people have been able to fly are aircraft that we don't have automated systems to support the pilot. The one type of aircraft they're not generally allowed to fly in Australia, which is your larger airlines, not only have things like the white strobes, not only do they predominantly fly in controlled airspace, where you have air traffic control providing a degree of separation, but you also have systems like TCAS, a traffic collision avoidance system, that would give you automated warnings of proximity to other aircraft. So there appears again, both in practice and just conceptually, to be a problem with the restriction that's been placed on people there. The last area is the PAPI, the Precision Approach Path Indicator, which is a glide slope indicator that's positioned next to a runway for pilots to use by night. And because it relies on a combination of red and white lights, there's a concern that certain kinds of colour vision deficient pilots would not be able to interpret those lights. Again, the confound for that theory is that over 25 years, there are hundreds of pilots who have flown thousands of approaches by night using PAPIs quite safely, which says that either the PAPI itself has additional cueing, whether it's the intensity of lights, or more probably the fact that there are enough redundant cues in the surrounding environment that the pilot can safely land. And that is backed up by the fact that CASA will provide an exemption that if an airfield, if the PAPI goes unserviceable, you can still fly your aircraft there and land it, which says that the PAPI is a nice thing to have, but it is clearly not essential for the operation to land an aircraft. So at the moment the concern is for these pilots, this minority group, that there has been a change in CASA's view. They have decided that they are going to review the safety of these people flying aircraft. They've written to the individual pilots, they've written to employers saying that research, which they haven't published, has shown that these pilots may be unsafe, but they haven't clarified what that is. The history over the last 25 years shows that that is not the case. Previous principal medical officers in CASA have shown a willingness to support pilots, and I'm concerned that the attitudes of a few within the regulator may be putting at risk this group, and albeit it's a minority group. In our democracy, we look after the rights of minorities. There is an injustice being done to this group, and I'll be working with the government to either fund another test case or to fund research to make sure that this group receives the justice that the last 25 years has shown that they are